as Tony said, I kind of wear these two hats of grassroots organizing, starting with Food and Water Watch, working on issues of fracking and GMO labeling and protecting our resources, and now working as the organizing director with World Beyond War that I've been with for about 3 years now. And then also with my other hat being on the farm and kind of doing this very tangible work of growing food and working with our interns every year. And I would be remiss not to mention that, because this kind of what I call my two-prong approach is really integral to me in sort of the way that I think about organizing and activism. And I think it's very important to be doing the policy advocacy work, which is going to be kind of the primary focus of today's presentation, but also kind of that on the ground tangible work, through the practices that we do in our daily lives, including our investments and where we shop and what we eat, and that those things are just as important in building the alternative world that we want to see. So a little bit more about World Beyond War. We are a decentralized global grassroots network. We have members in 190 countries. We just got a new country, and those are people who sign our Declaration of Peace. And we're member driven. We're funded by people who give as little as $5 a month to support our work. Our mission is quite broad and visionary, which is to abolish the institution of war and to replace it with what we call the alternative global security system, based on demilitarizing security and managing conflict nonviolently. And I think what sets us apart from other organizations is that we're opposed to all wars, all types of violence, and all forms of weapons. So we're quite principled in that outlook. So our work kind of fits into these two buckets, and we're focusing on the organizing bucket today, education, and then putting that knowledge into practice by organizing campaigns in our communities to enact change. So yeah, under the education pillar of our work is our book, which you might have seen, A Global Security System, an Alternative to War. And that lays out, the main strategies that we see as necessary for a world beyond war. And then within that, we have all of these different educational materials that have kind of spun off of the book, the study guide and online courses, webinars, fact sheets, that kind of thing. And those are really, again, aimed at kind of dispelling the myths of war and laying out the alternatives. And then our two campaigns, our activist campaigns, are weapons divestment and closing military bases, which we see as two critical steps that we won't be, we need to dismantle the war machine. We need to take the money out of war, and we need to shut down the infrastructure that is propping up war around the world, which is these bases, particularly foreign military bases. The US has 96% of all foreign military bases, which is about 800 foreign bases around the world. In terms of divestment, we're part of the Divest from the War Machine Coalition. I've put the logo in the bottom left there. And that's a national coalition of organizations around the country working at the grassroots level to divest at multiple levels, whether it's individual divestments or institutional divestment, like divesting universities, or working your way up from there, municipalities, states, pension funds, that kind of thing, focused specifically on weapons divestment and divestment from military contractors. And I could, I'm going to kind of skip over this, but if we want to go back in the Q&A, we can talk more about our campaigns, but I want to get to the organizing stuff. So what is organizing? I should preface all of this with the fact that there's different schools of thought. And so I'm going to be talking from the Midwest Academy School of Thought, which is where I was trained through Food and Water Watch. But there's many different schools of thought. So you may use these terms in different ways or define these things differently. But for me, organizing means building a movement around a certain issue. This involves setting clear goals, strategies, and tactics to achieve those goals. And it's about using our people power, our strength in numbers, to put pressure on key decision makers to enact the policies and changes that we want to see. And again, kind of in the Midwest theory, we have these three criteria that have to be met in order to be direct action organizing. I'm getting some feedback, so if you can mute yourself, thanks. So number one is to win concrete, real improvements in people's lives to make actual change that impacts their daily lives, such as a policy change or a change in legislation. Number two, giving people a sense of their own power. So through this process, you are building people's own sense of power in the sense that they realize how they, as a community, can come together and take action to enact change. And then number three, you're altering the relations of power over time. And so, what that means essentially is that, over time, people can become a stakeholder in the community. So it's not just about this one isolated campaign, but that through building this group, through building this campaign, you become a stakeholder in your own right. And so for future issues, the policymaker might come to that group, recognizing that they've developed this community group, they've developed this sense of power. And so they might then consult with that group over time. Let's see. Zoom is, okay, there we go. So in developing our campaign, right, the first step is to set clear goals. And so these goals should come in three different types: short-term goals, intermediary goals, and long-term goals. And it's so important to build these three types of goals as we're setting our goals, because these issues that we're talking about, if we're talking about abolishing the institution of war, right, that is something that we might not see in our entire lifetime. And so we need to build in these shorter term goals to keep the momentum going along the way, to give us a sense of victory and keep that momentum going and keep people encouraged. And so also with that, when you're setting these goals in a campaign, you might create kind of artificial goals in a sense that they could be internal goals or campaign goals, not necessarily policy goals. So it could be, we want 100 people to show up at our next meeting, or we want to have 1,000 petition signatures by next month. So those kind of internal goals as well can help people feel encouraged along the way, even if that policy change is many decades off. Okay, and so then one of the steps to building a campaign is to power map our target. And this is something I really want to emphasize, right, is to be really aware of who the target is, who has the jurisdiction and authority to enact the change, right? We've seen so many campaigns that are spending so much time, volunteer time, and money, and unfortunately their campaign is targeted at the wrong person, right, who doesn't really have the jurisdiction to make the change that they want to see. And so that's so crucial to determine, if, for example, you're trying to divest your university, who is it that has that power to do that? Is it the university president? Is it the board of directors? Who is it? And really determine that, and then that will help you build your campaign. And so this process of power mapping is looking at who or what influences that target or decision maker. And so through this, we can figure out who are the secondary targets that have leverage over that primary target. So for example, if our target is the governor, we might look at his funding. Is he being funded by a musician? And could we go to that musician and get him on our side in this campaign, get him to come out in support of the issue? And then will that have some leverage over the governor, right? Or maybe there's a powerful union that has endorsed the governor's campaign. Again, if we could get the union on our side, on our issue, that could have some sway over the governor. So that's kind of what this process of power mapping is about. Okay, so strategies. This is how we can move our target to align with our campaign goal. And again, there's lots of different sort of ways of defining this, but I'm going to talk about these three main strategies. One is champion, the second is cover, and the third is pressure. So a champion strategy is a case where our target or decision maker is very much on our side. They have been supportive of the issue. They've maybe come out a couple times, giving some positive words towards it. We think that they're almost there in terms of doing what we want them to do. And so we just need to give them that final push. So with this kind of champion strategy, we wouldn't want to do tactics that are alienating the target. We wouldn't necessarily want to do like a sit-in or a rally. That would be, overly negative. We want to give them positive encouragement and a positive press opportunity. So for example, a press conference might be the perfect tactic to do, We can come out side by side with our target and speak to the issue, and that gives us a good press opportunity. That gives the target a good press opportunity in a champion strategy. The opposite is the pressure strategy, where the target is, absolutely not on our side, has come out against our issue, and so we need to put maximum pressure on them. So that might be where a sit-in or a die-in or a rally or something even further escalated from there might be more appropriate in a pressure strategy. And then in the middle is the cover strategy. The cover strategy is where the target is basically trying to play both sides. They're trying to appease both camps, our side and the opposite. And so they're straddling both sides here so that they don't alienate any of their bases. And so in this case, we want to give them some cover, basically an excuse that they can point to so that they can still pretend to play both sides and say, oh, it was out of my hands. It really wasn't what I wanted to do, but I had to do it because of yada yada. And so that's the cover we want to give them. For example, making hundreds of calls into their office is something that they could point to. My hands were tied. I had hundreds of constituents calling my office. I just had to act. So that's an example of a cover strategy. Okay, campaign tactics. The tactics are essentially the activists' toolbox that we use to carry out our strategy. And again, we want to be sure that those tactics are aligning with the proper strategy and using tactics that are appropriate, and also scaling them when appropriate. So we might not necessarily want to start right away with something that is very confrontational, like a rally. We might want to start instead with a one-on-one meeting with the decision maker, see where they stand on the issue, and then decide the appropriate strategy from there and escalate the tactics as needed to increase the pressure as needed. So, there are hundreds of tactics, and I'm sure you've talked about some in your class already. This is in no way comprehensive, but these are some of the kind of staple tactics that we often use in a campaign: petitioning, postcards, letter campaigns, phone banking, generating calls into the target's office, sign-on letters and coalitions. This is very common as well. A sign-on letter, usually has a couple paragraphs about the issue, and then has a list of the signatories. And this is, meant to really show diversity and breadth for a campaign. We can have, faith organizations, parent-teacher associations, campus groups, environmental organizations, local businesses, et cetera, to show a huge diversity of support on the issue. And that's much stronger, right, than just World Beyond War coming out against something. Press events and town halls, those would be media type events, rallies, marches, sit-ins, die-ins, etc. Media, I've put here traditional and social media. So traditional, I mean letters to the editor, to your local newspaper, op-eds to your local newspaper. And then social media, obviously Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, that kind of thing. This can get very creative these days. And, one of the common things that we do is tagging a person so that they get a notification every time, right? So that can be very effective with hundreds of people who are tagging the targets. And every time they get that notification, that can be a reputational risk. And the last one that I put on here is bird dogging. This is kind of a fun tactic. Does anyone want to take a guess at what this is? And I can't see anything except my screen, so just shout out if you have a guess on this. All right, I'm not hearing anything. So yeah, bird dogging essentially means following someone around in the campaign, following the target around, and so that you're a steady presence. And this was really effective in the campaign against fracking in New York State, where activists were following Governor Cuomo around wherever he went, to the St. Patrick's Day parade, to his fundraiser with Bon Jovi, to Madison Square Garden. Wherever he made an appearance, there was always a group of activists who were following him around, and he really couldn't forget about our campaign. And he did cite that as a reason that helped him that amplified the campaign and helped push the decision over to ban fracking. So that's what bird dogging is. Okay, so this is the Midwest Academy strategy chart that I know you all looked at prior to this class. We've talked about a lot of these things already. The first column is goals, short-term, intermediary, and long-term goals that we already talked about. The fourth column is targets, primary targets and secondary targets that we've already talked about. And something that I think is really useful that they do put here is that a target is never a person. Sorry, it's always a person. It is never an institution or an elected body. And what they mean by that, I've seen various petitions or campaigns that are targeted to, the governments of the world or the US government, right? And what does that really mean? It's not very effective. So it's really important to have a target that is a specific person who, as we said earlier, has the jurisdiction to make the change that you want to see. And that allows you to do that secondary targeting process and that power mapping process. If you have that target that is a very clear target that you can then map out who influences them. So you do want to make sure that it is a specific person. The last column is tactics, as we've talked about already, and it has some that I didn't mention on there. Again, there's hundreds of possible tactics. And then the second and third columns we haven't talked about as much. The second column is organizational considerations. And again, this is something that I think is often overlooked, and it's so important to determine, what are the resources that you have on hand, monetarily, what are the finances that you have on hand? How many staff do you have? How many volunteers do you have? Listing out those resources, because if you don't do that kind of assessment in advance, we've seen so many campaigns that just don't really have the capacity. They're much too overstretched. So it's so important to be upfront about what you have on hand. And the middle column there is about allies and opponents. And again, this is important to do upfront of who can be your allies in this campaign. As we talked about, for example, figuring out secondary targets that might be able to get on your side and to leverage their power over the primary targets. And the opposite, who are your opponents? Again, thinking about that in advance and trying to preempt that and come up with strategies for that. Okay, so this slide is about recruitment. In organizing, we have this expression where we say, meet people where they're at, which means listening and tapping into people's own motivations and interest areas. I don't want to just push my petition on someone. I really want to start out by seeing what matters to them, what are their interest areas, and then working from there. If someone starts talking to me and talking about how they really care about the environment, then I can pivot and talk about, well, did you know that war is, the US military is the largest consumer of fossil fuels on the planet? And then so that allows me to kind of pivot from their interest to my campaign rather than just pushing my campaign on them. So when we talk about recruitment, there are two different sections here on the right-hand side. One is what compels people to join a group, and the second is what compels people to stay in a group. And I think that this can be very relevant to whatever type of campaign you're working on, or even if you're thinking about organizing an event, you could use these principles. So what compels people to come to an event or to join a group, etc. The first is altruism, which means simply that they care about the issue. They want to do good in the world. The second is transaction, a transactional reason. So this could be something even kind of trivial, like, there was pizza at the meeting and so I came. That was a transactional reason for coming to the meeting. Self-interest, my water is poisoned. I can't drink my water. It's in my self-interest to join this campaign and get involved. And number 4, social needs. I came to this event, I joined this campaign because I want to find community. I want to meet friends. And what compels people to stay in a group? Number 1, fun. This is sort of obvious, but it's something that I think is actually often overlooked in our work. We can kind of get like so focused on the nitty-gritty details of a campaign and lose the fun aspect and lose that community building aspect. And so we've been trying to incorporate more music and art and that kind of thing into our events as well. Constant learning, right? So people are compelled to come back time and time again because they feel like they're learning something if you build in guest speakers and trainings and that kind of thing. Leadership experience, especially for young people, right? If we feel like we're gaining leadership experience out of being part of the campaign, and over time we get to work our way up the ladder, kind of starting out as a volunteer, and maybe over time we get to be a manager of the volunteers in the campaign. That's something that we can put on our resume as well. And that's related to the next bullet point about responsibility. So, you know, people are compelled to come back time and time again when they feel that they have a responsibility to the group. I'm part of some committees where, you know, I don't really have a role. And so I'm like, why am I attending these committee meetings? But if I had a responsibility, even if it was something, again, maybe trivial, like taking the meeting minutes, that compels me to come back. And the last one is winning, right? As we talked about earlier, when you build in those short-term and intermediate victories, that helps keep momentum and keeps people coming back. Okay, so this slide is about different tactics for recruiting people to an event, to a campaign, etc. One section is retail, which is like one-on-one meetings with people or other one-on-one interactions, such as petitioning and talking with someone one-on-one when they're signing the petition, tabling at an event, which might be more like a virtual expo booth these days. Phone banking is another opportunity for those one-on-one interactions. And those are so important to build deeper connections, right? I think sometimes we can get so caught up in, you know, we need 100,000 petitions, signatures. And that's important too, to show our numbers, right? To show the strength of our movement. But at the same time, if we don't have those opportunities for those one-on-one connections, then we don't build those volunteer leaders who can step up and do the tasks that need to be done for the campaign. So both of these are really important, retail and wholesale. So wholesale is, you know, social media posts, flyering, email blasts, Google groups, that kind of thing, where you're broadcasting, right, to hundreds or thousands of people at a time. Okay, so the math of halves, this is jokingly called organizer math. You know, this is basically a way of reminding ourselves that it's really hard to get people to come to events and to get people involved in campaigns. And so we have to do a lot of work to get people to show up, and don't feel disappointed in yourself if it's hard. So in this case, we want 20 people to show up to our event. We start with 160 names and phone numbers. When we call those 160 phone numbers, we're only able to get a hold of 80 people. Of those 80 people, only 40 of them actually say, yes, I'll show up to your event. And of those 40 RSVPs, only 20 of them actually show up. So that just shows you kind of the expected attrition rate. And this is a generalization, but it gives you a sense of it. With our online events these days, we see about a 50% attrition rate of people who sign up and then those who actually show up for webinars. Okay. So this is just a very broad overview of media types that can be used in a campaign. And all of these types are kind of important in conjunction with each other. The first is owned media. So this is content that you create and self-publish, like your own website or blog would be a good example. Paid media, World Beyond War's billboard campaign is a great example of this, or Facebook ads is another example. And then earned media. So this is media that you earn through, you know, resharing, reposts, mentioning of your work by external sources. An op-ed that you get placed in a newspaper is an example of earned media. Okay, intersectionality. This is such an important thing, especially for our work at World Beyond War, because you know, for us, war, we see war through this very holistic lens that talks about how war is really at the nexus of so many other issues, in terms of the fact, for example, that war fuels racism, or war sucks trillions of dollars out of our economy, or war is one of the largest contributors to climate change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this allows us so many opportunities to connect with so many different types of groups and show that war and militarism is integral to their issue too. And so it allows us this opportunity to break out of what we call our issue silos, and to find common ground and to show more diversity of support for an issue. This is also called fusion organizing. And the Poor People's Campaign that started up again, the revival of the Poor People's Campaign a couple of years ago, which was based off of MLK's 3 pillars of militarism, poverty, and racism, plus the addition of environmental destruction as a 4th pillar. That campaign, I think, really symbolizes this type of fusion organizing that we're talking about. And it's so much more powerful when we have a diversity of groups coming out in support of an issue rather than just World Beyond War, some fringy group on its own advocating for something. And you can go to our website, or I could send this to Tony afterwards, but we have 7 fact sheets that we've created that go over what we call the 7 whys, the 7 ways that war is connected to lots of different issues, including climate change, racism, etc. And this is my last slide, so we have a lot of time for Q&A and discussion after this. But this is about coalition building. A coalition is essentially a group of groups, and this is something that I do on a daily basis. Again, it is so rare to work on a campaign in isolation. It's quite rare to be able to win something as one organization. So most of our work is done in coalition with other groups, which again kind of broadens the legitimacy of our campaign when we can say it's not just an anti-war campaign. We also have environmental groups. We also have yada, yada, yada. And so these are some kind of general principles in building a coalition. A couple of the ones that I think are important to highlight: defining the structure of the coalition. Coalition, as you probably know, is this word that's just thrown around a lot. And, for people, it means a lot of different things. For some people, it's a very, very formal structure that means, with elections and bylaws and a very formal structure. And for other people, it's very informal and just means, a couple of groups came together to work on an issue together. And so it can mean all of those things, but it is important to define that up front of, when you're entering a coalition relationship, what do we mean here, and kind of have those terms on the table of what is expected of each member group. And the other things I think are important to emphasize here are the importance of facilitation, not domination. This is probably the hardest part of coalition work, is every group has their own brand, their own sort of agenda, and kind of putting that aside and being able to work as a coalition. It's very hard to do, and that's kind of the biggest friction in a coalition, is the balance between self and your own organization and the larger group. And so it's so important to, whenever possible, pivot to other people in terms of giving them credit, raising up allies, naming allies, sort of going out of our way to do that. It's better to be on the safe side and do that than to take too much credit. And even, for very, very small things like a photo caption or something, I've seen relationships just, be destroyed because someone has shared a photo without permission. And so, just even something as small as that, just taking a second to think before you post, to think before you publish something. And I think, in my work, I see there can be sort of this rush that we're in, maybe this modern sense of trying to get things done very, very quickly. And so in organizing, I feel that I'm constantly being reminded to slow down and to make sure that everyone is consulted. And even if it needs to take 3 more days than you thought it would, that's much better to go ahead with everyone's permission rather than to move forward and lose allies in the process.